and kind of what led her to writing Jubilee, what brought her to Jackson and to Jackson State, and it introduced you to the woman who wrote this remarkable book that really, when it is published in 1966, is the first of its kind. It's going to launch a genre of fiction known as neo-slave narratives or neo-slave novels, and will include the likes of Alex Haley's Roots, of course, Beloved, so many others. But for her to publish it in 1966 in Jackson, Mississippi is a remarkable thing. And over the next several weeks, I would like to position her within the historical context. I am a historian after all. But with that said, I'd like to begin just with a little bit of Margaret's story. And I'm going to share my screen with you guys so that you can see some of the images of Margaret and talk a little bit more about her life and times. She was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1915. This is a beautiful picture of Margaret taken by the Harlem Renaissance era photographer Carl Van Vechten in his New York City studio. Some of you are familiar with his images there, particularly I think Zora Neale Hurston are probably some of the most famous images he took in that studio. Margaret's about 23 years old in this picture. But she's born in 1915 to fairly sophisticated parents who lived at the time in Birmingham. Her father was a teacher and a minister who had a master's degree from Northwestern University. Her mother, seen here, was a musician. And you can imagine Birmingham, Alabama in 1915 was not the most welcoming of places for a well-educated young Black family to live. And they pretty soon thereafter would find their way and move to New Orleans. And the image you actually see here of Margaret's mother, this is, if you can see on my screen, she is standing to the right. This is her concert orchestra in New Orleans. Just an amazing family. And they're going to encourage Margaret at an early age to read and to write. In fact, her father's going to give her a diary when she's just 13 years old, and she's going to keep journaling and writing in that diary for the rest of her life. We have those journals in our collections here at the Margaret Walker Center. They total about 13,000 handwritten pages, all of which have been digitized. You can go check them out and go through them. They're really a remarkable trove. In New Orleans, her father was teaching at what is today Dillard University. And among the people and events that he sponsored, when Margaret was 13 in 1928, he's going to invite Langston Hughes to campus. And Langston will come and give a book talk and do a book signing. And her parents, knowing that Margaret is, of course, a teenager, but a fledgling writer, want her to meet Langston Hughes. And so they make her get in line at the book signing to go up at Langston Hughes. This is 1928. So we're talking the height of the Harlem Renaissance, the height of Langston Hughes's fame. And Margaret is 13 years old. They also want her to give him some of her poetry to read. She's 13. So she goes through the line, she has the poetry, she meets Langston Hughes, but she's too embarrassed to give it to him. Her parents make her get back in line and do it again. And so she goes back through the line, this time does give Langston some of her poetry. And from that point on, he's going to be her mentor until the day he dies. Here's a picture, a beautiful picture of the 75th anniversary of Jackson State in 1952. That's, of course, Langston there sitting next to Margaret and a whole host of Harlem Renaissance era and Chicago Renaissance era writers, from Melvin Tolson and Sterling A. Brown to just an incredible group here. They would even travel, Langston and Margaret would, in 1943 to Yaddo, a writing retreat in upstate New York that some of you are aware of. And they would be the first African Americans ever invited to Yaddo in 1943. And again, Margaret would just be 28 years old. You can see her sitting on the left-hand side of the image, and Langston standing over to the right. Among other things, Langston would help Margaret get her first piece of poetry published when she's just 18 years old in the NAACP's Crisis magazine. It was a short piece called I Want to Write. But if you consider that it's 1933 and Margaret is being published by Langston Hughes in the Crisis, and her editor at the Crisis for her poetry at the time was W.B. Du Bois. That's pretty heady company for an 18-year-old in America. And so this is the world that Margaret is going to operate and live in. And Langston's going to encourage her to continue her education. Of course, she had very well-educated parents, and she is going to follow in her father's footsteps and move to Chicago and attend Northwestern University. And she will graduate with her bachelor's degree in English from Northwestern, and she's going to stay in Chicago. And thanks to Langston, she's going to be introduced to a whole host of really remarkable artists and writers, some of whom you saw in the image there before, Sterling A. Brown. She meets St. Clair Drake, the famous sociologist who wrote the book about Chicago called Black Metropolis. This is a picture that I love of St. Clair Drake delivering a lecture at Jackson State for a conference that Margaret hosted in 1971, the National Evaluative Conference on Black Studies. You can imagine how excited I was when in our vaults at the Margaret Walker Center, I found that image of Malcolm X hanging behind St. Clair Drake's head, stowed away in our archives. It's a great picture. Others that she would meet in Chicago, probably most formidably, which many of you may know, would be the Mississippian Richard Wright. And her relationship with Richard Wright was an incredibly formative one. And I think it's particularly important for understanding Jubilee and what happens in Jubilee, and how she writes Jubilee. Because at times, her relationship with Richard Wright was incredibly happy. It was very much a formative experience for Margaret intellectually. And yet he is going to leave Margaret, and it is going to devastate her. There is some argument around whether or not she was in love with Richard Wright, what kind of relationship they had. I would suggest if you spend some time in her journals and read through her journals and read some of the forlorn comments that she has about Richard Wright at that time, you get a good sense of how she felt. But it wasn't just this young woman who's kind of had her heart broken by a man. She also feels acutely used by Richard Wright. In particular, while she's in Chicago, she joins his Southside Writers Group. And while a member of Richard Wright's Southside Writers Group, she is going to type the manuscript of Native Son for Richard Wright, something that Wright's never going to acknowledge. And in the final versions of Native Son, Margaret is going to argue that there are pieces, parts of it that are going to find their way into the book that he actually took from Margaret and other works she was actually beginning to work, including pieces of Jubilee that would come into Native Son, some characters and some other things. And so she felt emotionally, personally kind of abandoned by Richard Wright, but she also felt intellectually abandoned and used, and is very clear about that. Something that she will repeat later in her life when it comes to her relationship with Alex Haley, at least intellectually. And I want to talk a little bit more about Alex Haley next time. Some of you may know that she actually sued Alex Haley for plagiarism with Roots. But again, that's a conversation I think for next week that we can get into. And so she's this incredibly well-educated woman now in Chicago who has learned so much from the people she's been able to be around, but also from the adult relationships she's had with folks like Richard Wright. And she makes a decision to move and leave Chicago and go to the University of Iowa, where she is going to join the second year of the University of Iowa Writers Workshop. The Writers Workshop, she gets there in 1939, her thesis that she writes will be her classic poem and book of poetry by the same name, For My People. What you see here is just an excerpt of For My People. Most of you know that it's a significantly longer poem. If you're interested, the Smithsonian Folkways Project recorded Margaret reading For My People, and you can download it for less than $1, I think, on iTunes, and you can actually hear Margaret reading For My People in her own voice. At the same time as she is graduating with her master's degree from the University of Iowa, For My People is getting some pretty significant literary attention, including in 1942, she is going to win the Yale University Younger Poets Prize, which is one of the most prestigious poetry prizes in the nation. And as part of that, her book of poetry, For My People, will be printed by Yale University Press. This is 1942. Margaret is 27 years old, and it's a moment that launches her really into much acclaim and quite a bit of fame. And she is being invited all over the country to give lectures and discussions and talks. And yet, at the same time as she makes this kind of appearance on the international scene, and I would add here too, just as a side note, during her time at the University of Iowa, her roommate in 1939 was a young artist who was doing an MFA at Iowa named Elizabeth Catlett, who would go on to be one of the great American artists of the 20th century and would dedicate a book of lithographs to Margaret's poem, Book of Poetry, For My People. But at the same time that Margaret is being kind of launched into this literary world that many of the people she had come to know, like Langston Hughes, were already occupying, she makes a decision that confronts so many women, right, to this day. And 1942, the same year as For My People was published, she is going to marry James Furness Alexander, who you see here. Alex, as she knew him, was a disabled World War II vet. And Margaret pretty immediately begins to have children. And so she's at this crossroads where she has to make a decision. And she makes a decision, and one that I think is repeated throughout her life, that sometimes is, we would consider a more conservative decision than what we might expect or might even hope. And I would suggest, again, in Margaret's life, we might actually see some things that are repeated in the lives of the main characters in Jubilee, including Vyry. And so Margaret makes this decision to settle down, to get married, and to have children. And the other image here is of her grandchildren at her home in Jackson. The problem is that Furness, being disabled, does not have an income. And so Margaret is the breadwinner for the entire family. And as such, she needs a stable job. She can't just go on kind of the literary circuit and you know, talk about her poetry and her works. And so she begins teaching. And for the next 7 years, for those of you who are in academia, you know how this can go. She kind of hops around from 1 year teaching appointment to 1 year teaching appointment until in 1949, Margaret is going to receive a post at Jackson State. Now, again, as a historian, let's understand this incredibly well-educated, renowned, world-renowned poet coming to Jackson, Mississippi to take a job at then Jackson State College in 1949 in the context of 1949 Mississippi, a world that was vehemently racist, dangerously racist for a woman who represented kind of the radical things that Margaret represented in her professional life. And her initial appointment at Jackson State was just at that time a 1 year appointment. If you go and look at her journals at the time when she's about to start her job at Jackson State, she talks about how she hopes that the job will last at least 2 years and that she'll be able to bring her family with her to live in Mississippi. So she moves to Jackson initially by herself in 1949. Her husband and her 2 oldest children stay in North Carolina, where they were living at the time, and her 2 youngest children go to stay with her parents in New Orleans. So here is this woman, this Black woman, moving to the racist and sexist world of Jackson, Mississippi in 1949 to launch a career at Jackson State that would last for the next 30 years. She would be on the JSU faculty from 1949 to 1979, and of course would stay in Jackson until the day she died in 1998. And so she makes this decision to come to Mississippi, and she stays in Mississippi with a life that frankly was very much rooted in kind of a conservative Christian ethos and this love of what we would consider relatively conservative, I suppose, gendered notions of motherhood and those things, and being a housekeeper and all of those things that come with that. And at the same time, being an artist and being an educator and being in Jackson, Mississippi. It's a difficult decision for Margaret, and it's one that she struggles with, and one that, again, if we look thematically at Jubilee and look at each of the sections, you probably recognize that in each section, Vyry has that choice. Do I stay or do I go, right? And she makes what is seemingly kind of conservative decisions based around that choice. And Margaret will stay in Jackson again for the rest of her life. I would note here too that when she moves to Jackson in 1949, a few years later, the family of Medgar and Merle Evers will move to Jackson and move to the same street as Margaret. And they would be close family friends. And you can see a picture here right behind the Punch and the Petit Fours of the Guine Street Garden Club. That was the street they lived on. Today, that's Margaret Walker Alexander Drive. Very famous, of course, for Medgar's house there today, but the street named for Margaret herself. That's Merle standing directly behind the Punch and the Petit Fours. And if you look to the right of the image, that's Margaret's second from the right of the Guine Street Garden Club. So this street that Margaret is living on is going to be an epicenter for her and for the modern civil rights movement in Mississippi and for the history of Jackson. And not only did Margaret and Medgar and Merle live on the same street, you probably know to this day the NAACP offices in Jackson, where Medgar's office was for a long time, are here right by the Jackson State campus on John R. Lynch Street. So they literally lived and worked on the same street. And that's sort of where I want to take up next week when we talk a little bit more about the context of Jubilee, the writing of Jubilee. It's going to take, she comes to Jackson in 1949, it's going to take another 17 years before Jubilee is published. And again, due to choices that she consciously made to have a settled job as a teacher and professor, to have a family, right? And things that, again, I think we see reflected throughout Jubilee. The one last thing I would note here before we kind of jump into the discussion of this first section of Jubilee is that, of course, in 1949, Eudora Welty was living in Jackson as well. And I jumped online today and did this on Google Maps. The Welty house and Margaret's house are exactly 4 miles apart. They're close. And by 1949, Margaret is a pretty well-known writer due to her poetry in particular. And later in life, Walker and Welty will become friends. And as Suzanne Mars and others here know quite well, she and Margaret and Eudora spent time on the speaker circuit. Carolyn Brown called it their sister act eventually. But in 1949, this was a segregated world that Margaret lived. And even though she was 4 miles apart from Eudora Welty, she would not exactly have been welcomed in the Belhaven neighborhood. And so within that context, I think it's important to note this connection, of course, between Walker and Welty and where we are today. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if you guys have any comments or questions. And again, I do want to jump next week and the next more into some of Margaret's history and the writing of Jubilee itself.
So feel free to unmute yourself if you have something to say, or raise your hand if you want to get my attention, or even make a comment in the chat.
So, you know, as those questions and thoughts come up, feel free to throw them out there. I'm looking at the chat as well, so I know Lauren will help me there if I miss anything. But do feel free to unmute yourself and join in. I guess we just begin at the beginning of this remarkable book. And I don't know how many of you were able to get the 50th anniversary edition that we published a few years ago with the new foreword by Nikki Giovanni, which I just love. An ebook and audiobook for the first time. I will note that, of course, Margaret founded the institute that I run now. And with it, when we received her manuscript collections, came the rights to all of her intellectual property. And so the Margaret Walker Center today owns the rights to Jubilee. So thank you to everyone who bought copies of Jubilee. You are supporting the work of the Margaret Walker Center and Margaret's direct legacy. I see a couple of questions in here. Why did she drop the Alexander in her professional name? Margaret never dropped Alexander in her professional name. And so when she comes to Jackson State, Alexander is her married name, of course. When she comes to Jackson State, she is going to use Dr. Alexander as her professional name at JSU. What she does is she never uses Alexander in her published works. And so her pen name, she always goes by Margaret Walker. And for us, we use both. So we, you know, we'll refer to Margaret Walker Alexander and Margaret Walker, but everything Margaret ever publishes, including Jubilee, long after she's married, she's going to publish under her maiden name of Margaret Walker. And so you'll see us kind of switch back and forth. But at Jackson State, if you talk to Jackson State alums, they remember Dr. Alexander. They will tell you all about Dr. Margaret Walker Alexander, but you will hear both. When did she move her family to Jackson? They're going to come about a year after her, so they're going to start coming around 1950, 1951, and then 3 or 4 later, you're going to see the Evers moving in here. Yes, Margaret did know her grandmother, and I want to talk some more about that. Vyry and Minna, the characters main characters in Jubilee, of course, are Margaret's very real great-grandmother and grandmother. And in fact, Minna, the character Minna, her name is Elvyra Ware Brown. And so Elvyra is where Margaret is going to get the name Vyry for her main character, who's technically representing her great-grandmother. Margaret's grandmother, the Minna character, will live with Margaret and her parents in New Orleans. And Minna, her grandmother, is going to begin telling her when she's a child the stories that will become the basis for Jubilee. And so it was not many decades in the making from start to finish. And I will next time, this is just a little bit of a tease, be sharing with you guys pictures of the real Minna and Vyry. We do have actual photographs of those women. And so I'll just leave that out there as a little bit of a tease there. What was the student composition of Jackson State in 1949? Jackson State is and was a historically Black college. It would have been nearly, if not all, entirely African-American in 1949 when she got here. There probably were some international students. And one of the things you'll see at historically Black colleges across America, despite predominantly white institutions being, of course, strictly segregated, particularly in the Deep South, HBCUs were never segregated. White students could always attend HBCUs. And on occasion, you would see particularly the children of faculty during the era of Jim Crow enrolled in classes and taking classes on the campuses of HBCUs. It was never very many, but they certainly were there from time to time. I see someone asking about Margaret's house today. Yes, it is still there on Margaret Walker Alexander Drive. The house today is still owned by the family. And the family has control of it. And in fact, her son, Sigismund, lives in the house with his wife, Norma. And so they are still there. Let's see. Now I see my incredible archivist, Miss Angela Stewart, here on the discussion also. She's a great resource for information about Margaret and about all the work we do here at the Margaret Walker Center. So I would be interested to know, since we got still another 30 minutes to jump into this, how this book, particularly this opening section, and for me, the opening scene of Jubilee, how that really impacts you as you begin this story and this journey with Vyry. And I would throw that out there to anybody who's interested in joining in. I see a few people have unmuted themselves, so I don't know.
I did feel bad for her. I often wonder what life would have been like if she would have stayed with her mom, Sis Hetta, and her stepdad. Because when I read the story, I was told that she had to live with Unsuki, I believe,
Yeah,
in order to avoid being terrorized by her stepdad. So I noticed it was very much so a sense of community.
Yeah.
Very much so, a very tight-knit community, really, among the slaves.
And if we consider that Jubilee is published in 1966, and this opening scene is Margaret's very real great-great-grandmother dying in childbirth from being repeatedly raped by her master, right?
Wow.
What an incredible, heartbreaking, painful story.
Yes.
And yet to publish that as your opening scene in 1966 while living in Jackson, Mississippi, what a remarkable thing.
Yeah.
How did it impact the rest of you? Thanks, Crystal.
Yeah.
So, hi.
Hi.
I was thinking about Jake, Hetta's husband. Is that his name? Okay. So I was really struck by how helpless he felt during this situation, and thinking about him realizing his wife, he had no power over the fact that his wife was the master's mistress, you know, that the master could come in at any time and rape his wife, and he just had no say over it, and that she was dying in childbirth because the master had raped her, you know, so repeatedly, so many times. And it got me thinking about, you know, this in a very historical sense, like this violence towards African Americans, and just the power dynamic of like you know, not being able to, in so many situations, from slavery through Jim Crow through the civil rights movement, not being like able to stand up against that power dynamic, and if so, like so much violence being called, like, not my verbs are not coming very good right now. I'm sorry.
I think that's right on. And in fact, what you see is a theme throughout American history of systemic violence aimed at marginalized and particularly African American communities and African American women. And you're right, that the powerlessness of not just Jake, but the entire community of the plantation, right? The entire slave community. And yet in little ways, they're always trying to reclaim that power. And I also think for my African-American history classes, this is the duality of the Black experience. It's oppression, but it's also resistance to that oppression, and a fight for fundamental human dignity. And so you do see both. I would say this too, in a historical context. Remember 1966, you're coming right on the heels of the 100th anniversary of the American Civil War, and what is a rising tide and kind of Confederate propaganda in and around Jackson, right? And this Old South mythology that really begins taking deep root in the early 20th century, but then there's a real resonance to it in the 1960s, not just because of the 100th anniversary of the Civil War, but also of the burgeoning civil rights movement, right? And so this story is published at kind of the height of this renewed nostalgia for the Old South. And the very first thing Margaret does is just take a sledgehammer to that nostalgia with that opening scene, and really try to reveal the depths of the depravity of the white South, right? In that moment.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So in thinking about that duality that you're talking about there, the powerful, powerlessness and resistance to the power, I'm really struck and not sure what to think about the scene where at the very end of that first chapter where, let me make sure I get the name right. Is it Granny?
Ticey.
Yeah.
Ticey, who runs down the road, like pulls her, clothing up and is just like, expressing her grief so viscerally. Everybody's kind of shocked by, the fact that like she seems to be kind of out of it in the sense that like she's showing her nakedness and she's, like showing her full vulnerability here at her total grief in that moment.
And that moment also, not only is it this, of course, this just moment of pure pain for Granny Ticey, Margaret throughout Jubilee also weaves in Africanisms. And so what Granny Ticey is expressing, it would be considered what was a death wail, and rooted in African traditions and brought to the Americas by slaves. And so there's actually a tradition of what you see in that scene that is very much a part of African history and the diaspora in America. So it is this incredibly moving moment of grief for her. But Margaret spent 30 years researching Jubilee, right? Not just writing the story, but making sure that she got the history right and the details right. I see a couple of other questions in the comments, and Suzanne, I see what was the critical response to the publication of Jubilee. I want to talk about this more in the next 3 weeks. The people in Jackson did not take, the white newspapers and the Clarion Ledger and the Hetterman brothers did not pay very much attention to Jubilee at all. It's going to be lauded kind of nationally and internationally. She's going to win. It's published by Hart Mifflin Harcourt, which still is the publisher to this day, and she's going to win the big Houghton Mifflin Prize for books that year for the best novel. It's going to receive some pretty intense criticism, which I think is a point of conversation for us to have as well, particularly from the Black community, because there were, and this is again in the context of 1966, there were Black readers who thought the character Vyry was too conservative, and that they wanted Vyry to make different decisions than what Vyry made over the course of her life. And so one of the questions I ask about this section in particular, and that we again see in each section, is how do you feel about the fact that Vyry didn't run away with Randall Ware when she had the opportunity to? And Randall Ware was a real man. Randall Ware was Margaret's great grandfather who did have a smithy in Georgia. Margaret actually traveled to Georgia, found his smithy that was still standing 100 years later. And this moment where Vyry clearly has a choice to be made. Now we can talk about whether she was going to leave her children or not, and whether she should have left her children or not. But there certainly were Black readers at the burgeoning at that moment in 1966. You're really at the outset and at the growth of the Black arts movement. And so there were Black artists who were writing at that time who just thought Jubilee was too conservative and thought Vyry was too conservative. Any thoughts about how you feel in that regard?
See, Beverly has her hand raised.
In light of what you said about Margaret Walker Alexander herself and the choices that she made, I thought it was believable. I mean, you want a superhero you know, when you're reading it, you won't, that opening scene is so horrible. And then the whole first section, you know, with what happens to her after she's caught when she tried to run away, and what happens to some of her friends. What you want to happen is a hero. But what did happen was probably a realistic view. I mean, she told Randall Ware from the beginning that she couldn't go without her children.
Right.
And he said, I hope to see you there, and I want you to be alone, and we'll take care of the children later. So I think she's an admirable character, and that she makes the choices, even though they end up being horrible, and she's punished horribly for it. At the end of that section, they're the choices that were right for her.
Yeah, and Margaret's telling the story of her real great grandmother. So, you know, this is a story that was passed down to her. So it is, you know, semi-biographical, right? What she's doing, and really, what's fiction is primarily the dialogue. Everything else are stories that are passed down to Margaret from her grandmother. So these are choices too that her grandmother and great grandmother themselves would have made. That I think are also, again, somewhat reflected in Margaret's own kind of relatively, what we would consider relatively conservative decisions, even though we might think that we might have wanted to make a different decision.
We've got Laura has her hand raised, and then Claire.
Yeah, in thinking about the fact that it's like Margaret Walker's grandmother's recollections, I was struck by how much information we were getting about the master and the mistress. And it was really kind of reflective to me of the sense of how much kind of the enslaved individuals really were kind of on the radar of information, how much they picked up. And so I think that kind of Suzanne's question also struck me as this kind of, the book is revelatory in both senses, in that it's this kind of confession of both the life that the grandmother leads, but also this inner knowledge of being the fly on the wall for the White family also. Yeah,
agreed completely. And I will say this too about Jubilee, again, in this concept and in this context rather of the Old South nostalgia. Of course, one of the key components of that is the defense and elevation of white Southern womanhood, right? And yet Big Missy is not exactly a character who you're really empathize with in this book at all, right? And there is the curtain is drawn back on the white women that you meet in this book in particular, in a way that is incredibly powerful and revealing. And look, the truth is, Big Missy is a victim in this story as well, as horrible as she is at times. And that the scene of hanging Vyry in the closet, right, for hours, as brutal as she was, she also was a victim of the world that she lived in, and the you know, the infidelity of her husband, and having to live with that all around her, right? And when we see the images of Vyry, the real Vyry very easily passed as white, very easily. And so the moment when you see that Vyry, Mrs. Salina gets so upset because Vyry looks so much like her own daughter, that was a very real thing for that family to live through. So, but Laura, that's a great point, a very good point. Somebody else had a hand up or a question.
Claire, and then Michelle.
Yeah, back to the idea that Vyry is making these kind of traditional decisions. I guess one of the things that maybe challenges that some is that she doesn't follow kind of what we think of as traditional gender norms in some ways, right? So Randall Ware has told her very clearly what to do. Leave and leave your children behind. But she kind of fights for what she wants and what's important to her within that context. Or she goes to the master and says to him, I want to be free, I want to marry this man, and it doesn't go the way she wants it to go, but she stands up for herself and asserts herself in some ways that maybe wouldn't be considered traditional ways of acting as a woman. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, she's of course also constrained by the institution of slavery itself, and she realizes that if she does leave her children, that she is risking their lives. And she makes this point, Vyry does, right? If I leave my children, Missy Salina is going to sell them. Randall, you say that they're going to be there when we get back, but trust me, like Missy Salina is not going to keep these children around. She's going to sell them south. And the fear of being sold away from your family was as much a fear as the fear of the beatings, the brutality, the death. And it also emphasizes the significance of the extended Black family, which is something that I like talking about with my students in conversation as well. And you see it very immediately with Vyry, right? These other women who come into her life to raise her and take care of her. So yeah, she's within this context as well. And I see a note here, a question about why Vyry calls Big Missy Ole Miss and why that term comes. Yes, Ole Miss is a slave term. The etymology of it has been very well researched and comes in vogue in Mississippi in the early 20th century as a term to use to represent the University of Mississippi because of this Old South nostalgia and the University of Mississippi being seen as this mother institution for the state. So yeah, the etymology of the term Ole Miss is in fact from slavery and what slaves used to describe the slave mistress on the plantation.
Robby, Michelle has her hand raised, and then there's a question in the comments from Harriet that might lead into another one of your questions that you posted.
Hey, so I think in relation to what you're talking about, why Vyry wouldn't leave the plantation, I wanted to kind of talk about this idea of feeling bound to different things and different systems. And so, this idea of, obviously, yes, she's bound to her children. Like you said, there's that fear that her children would be sold off, if she left. Bound by lack of opportunities, if she didn't wait for Randall to come. I mean, I'm kind of jumping ahead, I guess, to the next section, but I don't want to do too much of that. But, bound by this idea because she's a woman, maybe there's this fear of if she strikes off by herself or even with her children and can't meet up with him or, whatever, that she can't make it on her own, even if she does have freedom, even though she's obviously shown she's not helpless. I never really get the sense throughout the book that she feels like she knows there's a way for her to make it without some kind of community, And
let's remember too, Vyry loses every mother figure in her life.
Yeah.
Every woman who takes on the role of Vyry's mother figure is either sold away or dies, right? Yeah. And so here's a woman with her own children, does not want to risk losing them in any way whatsoever, and is very much committed to that. So yeah, that's a great point, Michelle. I did see Harriet's question about Rising Glory Church. This was a very common thing. Of course, there was a version of Christianity that the masters, slave owners wanted slaves to take in. And that very much was the one rooted around slaves should be obedient to their master. And what you hear, right, I think very clearly in the 4th of July hanging that they go to, and the sermon that the white preacher gives at that 4th of July hanging, right? That's the version of Christianity that the white folks in the South want slaves to accept. But constantly there were versions of the Rising Glory Church that are going to meet in the swamps and in the backwoods. They're going to meet secretly, that's going to use the Bible for their own purposes. And the truth is, in slave communities, Jesus was not the hero of the Bible. It was Moses. Moses was the person that slaves looked up to, and that's the person that they emulated, right? For obvious reasons, and leading his people to freedom. And so, yes, there are plenty of examples of very similar churches like Rise and Glory. And despite the edicts against being able to read and write, there are plenty examples of Black preachers like Brother Ezekiel who are literate, and others who secretly are literate, right? And who play key roles on the Underground Railroad, as Brother Zeke does, and are essential parts of that community. So, yeah, great question there. And
Harriet, I see. Oh, go ahead, Robby.
No, Lauren. Who else?
I just said Harriet had her hand raised, so I wondered if she had a follow-up comment on that.
It was actually, I was thinking more about the 1960s and relationships between men and women. And what I notice is that both Vyry and Big Missy are characters who are presented as making decisions independent of the advice that their husbands are giving them.
Right.
And I think, this sense that I don't have a sense that Vyry's decision is conservative. I think it's realistic, and I think that I don't think the outcome would necessarily have been any different if she had gone alone, since they've been watched. But I think the risk to the children is, I just feel that scene very poignantly as she is dealing with it. And I also think that the Big Missy portrait of a woman who is really running the plantation, who has a husband who thinks he has some convictions, but who never is able to act on them, is interesting in terms of the times and rise of feminism. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I would say, Harriet, I agree with you and with that analysis. In the context of 1966, there were some people in the community who were quite critical, in the Black arts movement community in particular, who were quite critical of the character Vyry and of Margaret for writing her that way. They wanted someone more revolutionary, and we can talk about this more next week too. 1966 is the year of the Meredith March. It's the year that Black Power gets coined in Mississippi, right, by Stokely Carmichael and Willie Ricks. And so there is an atmosphere around the civil rights movement, the Black arts movement, that's kind of pushing things to be a little more outspoken and a little stronger in that regard. Other questions? I was going to bring up this moment at the 4th of July and what that meant to you guys and how that impacted you too, because that's one of those seminal moments in the book. I see Beverly.
Well, I mean, you got to do Frederick Douglass. I mean, that immediately comes to mind. What to the slave is the 4th of July. And we see a perfect example in that setting. Not only do we have the slaves doing all the work, we're there for a hanging, and the slaves are worked half to death to prepare the picnic for the others, and they have liquor and all, but as Vyry tells us, what good is that? They were too tired to drink it. And so Frederick Douglass came to my mind immediately.
Yeah, and I, in the context of the social justice movements of this summer, right, I thought it was amazing that Frederick Douglass, What to the Slave of the 4th of July, just became ubiquitous this year. Mm-hmm. Like, it was everywhere, and really a powerful thing to see, and one of my favorite things to teach. I do see a point here from Beverly too about power, and the shifting of power, and that's one of the questions that I ask as well, and how enslaved people, despite their oppression, take power, right? And in little ways, in small ways, and how they resist. And it's, it's the slave women taking food from the kitchens, right, and going back to their cabins and having biscuits that they've made. It's stealing the meat, right, when they steal all of the meat from the from the shed outside. All these little ways and large ways, running away, right, and leaving, that they attempt to reclaim that power as well. See, Elizabeth has her hand up.
Yes, that scene on the 4th of July, the thing that struck me is the way the division between the groups of people watching, and the tremendous pain and torture, really, it is for all those slaves to be required to be there. It's horrifying. And then on the other hand, you have these people having a party. The inhumanity is so powerful in that scene. I think it's one of the most powerful parts. I haven't finished the whole book, but of what I've read so far, I've read part 1. I think it's one of the most powerful moments in that book that I've read so far.
Yeah, and she comes back to moments like that. And when I teach that moment too, most of you understand the concepts of race and gender and class being social constructs, right? Being created by society and being taught and being learned. I really think that 4th of July moment is a very clear example of the white power structure trying to teach race to the community, trying to teach race to the enslaved people and to the white people, the young people who are there to watch it. It's a very obvious moment of how race and racism and white supremacy are socially constructed.
Yeah.
I just want to note there's a really fascinating conversation happening in the chat too about hush harbors. And so thank you to everyone who's chiming in there. It's really interesting.
Absolutely. And slave women, and part of the point here in this is that slave women do play incredibly critical roles in the slave community, right? And are essential parts of the story of slave resistance and slaves and survival, just surviving from day to day.
Well, we have a few minutes left. Robby, do you want to close us out with anything, or do we have time for maybe one more comment?
Does anybody have a last comment or question? And I see Michelle's point about the humanity of ignoring the violence against Black people. I make very clear that what we see today, at least when in my classes and when I'm talking to groups, that what we see is just continuity in American history. We're not at some new moment in time. This is a story. This violence aimed at Black communities and at marginalized communities and at poor people is one that is endemic in American history and found throughout. And we can trace it very directly from the founding of this nation, right, as a slave nation. And the great founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, their power being built as slave owners and through the institution of slavery. And so, yes, what we see today, we're not at some new kind of moment in time. This is, we're at a moment of historical evolution, but it's not new. Other questions or thoughts? So I guess the last thing that I would really just say is look forward to joining you guys again for the next 2 weeks. This has been great. And of course, next week we will examine the Civil War, which is another moment where Vyry has this choice to make. Does she leave the plantation when everybody else is left? Does she stay, and does she take care of Missy Salina? And these choices keep confronting Vyry, and we'll come back to them. I do want to position Jubilee a little bit more within that historical context of 1966 and what it meant to publish that book. And I think if we do think, as you're reading it, if we think about what it meant for this Black woman to publish this book while living in Jackson, Mississippi in 1966, she was literally risking her own life. Remember, Medgar's been assassinated on the street she lives on in 1963. And I recognize and you know, laud the praise that Eudora Welty gets for Where's the Voice Coming From, right? But the impact of Medgar's death on Margaret is much more palpable. And we can talk some more about that next week and what that meant for the publication of Jubilee in 1966.
Thank you so much, Dr. Luckett, and thank you so much for everyone that joined. This was an incredible discussion. So we'll be discussing all of that and part 2 next week. So we'll see you back here Tuesday at 12 p.m. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
You all appreciate it. See you next week.
All right, great.
Bye.